All right. Now, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Iowa Learning Farms virtual field day. My name is Elena Whitaker, and I'm a water and conservation educator with Iowa Learning Farms. A little bit about Iowa Learning Farms. We were established in 2004, so we're celebrating our 20th year, which is very exciting. And our goal is to build a culture of conservation, working with farmers and researchers to implement practices that improve water quality and soil health, all while remaining profitable. I'm going to read through our list of partners here really quickly. The Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, Iowa State University Extension Outreach, the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture, Iowa Department of Natural Resources, Conservation Districts of Iowa, Iowa Farm Bureau, Practical Farmers of Iowa, GrowMark, Iowa Agriculture Water Alliance, Iowa Corn, the Iowa Nutrient Research Center, and Sea Change. So thank you all for joining us today, and thank you to our partners. If throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, you can go ahead and submit them to me in the chat, and then I will get them asked to our presenters. Speaking of our presenters, we're joined today with Dr. Matt Helmers and Dr. Mark Licht, both with Iowa State University, Ross Ebelsizer with the Northeast RC&D, and then Alex Schaefer with Iowa Soybean Association. Again, the whole idea of these virtual field days is starting the conversation. So again, if you've got a question, submit it in the chat, or once our main video is over, if you want to ask to be unmuted and you want to ask your question live, that is perfect as well. So again, we're talking about relay intercropping today, what it is, and the different components of the new grant project led by Iowa Learning Farms. And we're also going to be sharing some early results from the Multi-Cropping Iowa project and on-farm trials conducted by the Iowa Soybean Association. So without further ado, we'll get things started with the video.
Hello and welcome to windy Northwest Iowa. I'm Liz Ripley, the Conservation and Cover Crop Outreach Specialist with the Iowa Learning Farms. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about relay intercropping, and some of you may be wondering, what is relay intercropping? Well, relay intercropping is the process of having two crops growing simultaneously in the field at the same time. So for example, following corn in this system, we would seed a winter cereal rye or winter wheat. In the fall, post-harvest, in the spring, we'll come in, we'll plant our soybeans into that living rye or wheat. We'll then harvest the small grain rye or wheat, and then follow the harvest of soybeans as traditionally done. And then in our system here, for this project in particular, we're going to be using a oat cover crop then ahead of our corn. So in that case, we're getting 3 crops in 2 years: small grain, soybean, corn. So it allows for intensification in a sustainable way, because we're essentially keeping living roots in the ground year-round. And this project has a lot of great features, which we'll talk about here as we go along today. Yeah, so this system is going to be a little bit higher risk than a traditional corn and soybeans, because we do have these dual crops growing in the field. So some of the risks may be that we have competition out there. When we're harvesting the small grain itself, we want to make sure that we're not clipping off the soybeans, and so that we're getting this system in a way that we're not detrimentally impacting either crop yield, reducing our traffic in the field. All those things could add to increased risk from our traditional corn and soybean system that folks are interested in. But there are ways to de-risk this system. So for example, folks could utilize a skip row when planting the small grain, so that there's a dedicated row to planting the soybeans, so you limit that competition. Possibly even harvesting that small grain at an angle to change your traffic pattern in that field, or looking at taller varieties, so that way when your small grain reaches maturity, that grain is up higher and you have less risk of clipping off the top of your soybeans. Another way that this has been de-risked is that the USDA RMA, or Risk Management Agency, has now a provision that with a written agreement, folks can get full crop insurance for this kind of relay system. So I encourage you, if you are interested, to make sure you're having that conversation with your crop insurance agent to make sure that you're getting that coverage that you need for your system. So this project in particular is funded by the NRCS. It's got both on-farm demonstrations as well as research farm demonstrations like where we're at today at Gilmore City. We have 6 farmer partners in both eastern and south central Iowa that are utilizing this relay intercropping system. And in that, we're collecting a variety of data, both soil and water, to see what the environmental impacts of this system is, as well as looking at the profitability of these systems. So how can we both intensify our sustainability and make it a profitable system for our producers? So we're looking at those different factors, and we're excited to be sharing those results as we go along. A unique feature of this project is that we're also doing an intense social aspect of it. So we're excited to see the outcomes of that project. So stay tuned for different updates and reports as we go along. But we're just kicking this off, and we're excited to have you all with us today.
I'm Matt Helmers with Iowa State University and Director of the Iowa Nutrient Research Center, and fortunate to be collaborating with the Iowa Learning Farms on this relay intercropping project. Some of the benefits that we might see from the relay intercropping in the area I work on nutrient reduction, by having more things growing on the land, more living cover, we really hope to reduce that nitrate leaching that's coming out of our drainage systems, but really that hasn't been quantified, so we're really excited to look at quantifying that both at this site here at Gilmore City as well as some of the farmer demonstration sites across the state. We're also going to be looking at what are the impacts on soils. So we're looking at some of the soil health metrics and soil aggregate stability kind of at the start of the project, and then 3 years down the road to see if we're improving some of that soil health of these systems, which we think has that potential by having more living roots in the ground, more residue a greater portion of the year. And certainly with the project, we'd be looking at the benefits from the economics for the farmer if they are getting 3 crops harvested in a 2-year period, kind of what that might mean for some of the profitability of their operation. At our Gilmore City site here, this is a drainage water quality site that we've had in place for about 30 years. Been able to look at a lot of different things from nitrogen management to our more traditional cover crops. And so at this site, what we'll be able to look at is how does that relay intercropping under a no-till system compare to a no-till corn soybean without cover crop, or a no-till corn soybean with a cereal rye cover crop. So we can compare those 3 different systems. The traditional cereal rye or the traditional no-till systems have been in place a while, but that relay intercropping is new. And so, we're pretty excited to see kind of how those 3 systems compare to one another as we look at different years. So the hope would be we'd do at least 3 years of study here, and maybe we'll be able to get funding to look at it for longer so we can see how it performs both from an environmental standpoint but also a production standpoint under different weather conditions. As Liz kind of talked about, there could be some risks, and in maybe drier years we might be a little worried about does that rye use up some soil moisture that the soybeans might want to have later in the season. And so hopefully we'll have some different weather conditions. We're really hoping that we get some rain. We're going on 4 years of hardly any drainage at this site, so hopefully by putting in this system we'll get some more rain so we can understand the nutrient leaching impacts with that relay intercropping compared to our traditional corn soybean rotation or corn soybean rotation with winter cereal rye. What excites me about relay intercropping is hopefully we get some of the same nitrate reduction benefits of a traditional cover crop, but there may be some economic benefit for the farmer. So one of our challenges, especially as we think about north central Iowa where we're at, we don't have a lot of livestock maybe to graze the cover crop, so there's not necessarily an economic value for our cover crop. There's a lot of other benefits, but maybe not an economic value. So could the relay intercropping provide some economic benefits while still protecting our soil and water resources?
All right, so really quick, I just want to also plug next 2 weeks from now on March 21st, we have another virtual field day coming up. It is all about the perennial ground cover system, and so for corn systems in the Midwest. So please join us 2 weeks from now, same time, 1 p.m. For that. Now, moving on to questions. And again, if you have any questions, go ahead and send them my way, and we'll make sure that they get asked for all of our presenters here. We've got a couple so far. First question is, in this system, what does my nitrogen availability look like? Whoever wants to answer that.
I'm not an agronomist, so we'll put that on our agronomist.
So I think there's probably two different aspects of it to look at, right? So like nitrogen availability for the small grain versus nitrogen that's in the soil at the end of the system that we're either trying to capture or at least keep from being lost, right? So from the and Alex and Ross can jump in here too, but I think from the standpoint of what's needed for that small grain, it does vary a little bit depending on how much leaching you have or how much potential nitrogen mineralization you'd have. But we generally think it's probably somewhere in the 35 to 50 pounds of nitrogen for that either rye or wheat crop. Now, obviously, the soybeans don't need that. They're gonna be benefiting from the nodulation and nitrogen fixation out of those nodules, just like a typical soybean crop would.
I'll add to that just a little bit. Based on the trials that we've done, we have a couple of producers that have looked at available nitrogen following relay. So following the rye and soybeans going into corn, they have looked at available nitrogen that following spring and found that after relays versus just after beans, it seems to be higher. And then they're using that information to then they don't have to apply as much. So they're reducing their fertilizer bill for the next year, going into corn, which then means more profitability on that corn crop.
Fantastic. Okay, so another person asked, does the relay intercropping system, does it affect soybean standability? And in this system, are soybeans shorter or taller than normal?
So I think I can take a stab at this one, and having, we've done 20-25 trials, on-farm trials with relay over the years, and they've varied in configuration to where we've left the skip row like Liz has talked about, or other locations the cereal rye or the small grain has been solid seeded and the beans planted into that. And why I call that out is because in the solid seeded cereal rye, the beans, early they tend to get leggy and they grow up and they're reaching for sunlight, and when we've row indexed or left a blank space to plant that soybean into, they generally stay a little bit more compact and normal structure like a conventional soybean would be. I guess I haven't seen after rye harvest, like the beans continue to be leggy and get super tall and fall over. In fact, my gut would be to say that they're generally going to be a little bit shorter just because they've dealt with some competition for, their vegetative growth cycle.
Yeah, I agree with Alex. As far as going a step further, thinking about lodging, I don't have much experience with this other than a couple of years where I did try it. But just talking to a couple of farmers that I know have done it, they said that small grain in some respects helps keep those soybeans standing a little bit better too. But again, it just depends on how well that so to speak, the stems stay after harvest as well. So
this might maybe could share quick that the time lapse that Ross has put together, kind of so people can see that growing out there and kind of the height differential. I'll try to do that if I can here. Hopefully this this started. Cheers.
Perfect. Yeah, so
Oop,
that was a
just a
little
sec.
video to kind of just showing the growth season, right, of the relay intercropping system. So yeah.
I have a question for Ross and Alex and Mark. Can I ask a question? Um, the thinking about harvesting that rye a little bit early. Have you had producers that have harvested a little bit early and then kind of run air over it in a bin to dry it, maybe a additional couple points, and that might gain you a week or two of getting it off over those beans?
Yeah, and so looking at all the data that Iowa soybean has generated over the years, relay versus sole crop, one of the two biggest management factors that will protect yield of soybeans is small grain harvest date. Getting that off early is good, but the challenge is drying grain in July, humidity's up, you need to have some sort of heat drying mechanism, like just blowing air through the bin. Some folks have struggled with that, so definitely a consideration to make.
Perfect. Okay. Another question is, what are people doing then with the harvested rye?
So that's one of the challenges, I guess, that is probably the biggest thing is marketing. So far, a lot of the farmers that have tried this I always tell people, first of all, be your own market. So a lot of people are using this as a way to grow their own cover crop seed and do so in a way that is, they're not displacing any soybean acres on their farm. You can grow your own cover crop seed and then use that you can grow a lot of seed on a few acres. So that's probably step number one, your first option. A lot of people are then just selling locally to neighbors and things for cover crop seed, as VNS, or, variety not stated, cereal rye. However, the goal with this overall project is to make this a mainstream practice. And that's where we start to run into barriers, because if everybody's doing this, pretty soon there's no neighbors to sell to, right? So what we're looking at are things where we can make this a more, more mainstream rye markets, build that up a little bit. And so that's what we'd like to see. There's, even just the cover crop business, as it expands, we're seeing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of acres of cover crops added every year. That is continuing to expand. The goal for the state is 12.5 million acres. That's an incredible amount of seed, and we still import most of ours into the state of Iowa. Some other options, though, there are, for higher grade small grains like wheat or even rye, using that for food or flour, for animal feed. We would love to see, think about the landscape if we could get 10 or 15% of our overall swine feed shifted over towards cereal rye, which is a proven low cost substitute for swine feed. But if we could do that, that would mean a lot of acres that could be shifted over and not be continuous corn. So there's options. There are obviously reasons, there are kind of some challenges in doing that, but those are some of the things that we could do with it. We've even seen some used in beer production in the state. So that's a little bit more fun way to use the cereal rye, but it's definitely not a high volume use of it.
Perfect. Okay, so another question is, are any chemicals used for weed control, or are you solely relying on the rye to control weeds?
So yeah, a lot of our trials have been run pretty lean. Usually I would say the most common is a passive herbicide after the small grain's been harvested. So varies a little bit from operation to operation, but cereal rye does a pretty good job of choking stuff out early.
The other part of that is that once that rye is off, then those soybeans do close canopy pretty quickly. So there's I'll call it a fairly narrow window, that you'll have weed emergence, and you may actually have some of that rye seed. I'll call it volunteer, right? That comes out and germinates. And so depending on how much of that you want to kill off, you may need to wait for a week or two until you get a little bit of germination and moisture on it. So.
All right, another question. What seeding rates have been looked at for solid seeded rye versus skip row?
A good question. We haven't, I guess I wouldn't say in our projects that we've set up with farmers, we haven't really dictated that input, but it hasn't changed. So usually around a bushel or a little bit less is what most of the farmers that I've worked with are doing this, whether solid or row indexed.
I would say the qualifier there is that in most situations, I would say people are adding the rye as the second crop to soybeans. I would say maybe the exception to that, where we've seen a little bit of exception to that, is where a couple of producers were actually already growing rye and added the beans so they were growing rye for seed and selling it. So they had probably maybe a little higher population. Is that right, Alex? Probably to start with, just because they were already kind of doing it that way. So just, I guess, kind of think about that as you're laying it out.
That does get into a little bit about at least my part of this overall project, right? And so we're going to be looking at the seeding date and seeding rate of cereal rye. And then on the other side of it, we'll be looking at the soybean maturity group and seeding rate as well, because those are somewhat unknowns right now. Yeah, I mean, if I look at cereal rye or winter wheat or triticale, right? If you're going to grow that for grain kind of as a sole crop, there's definitely management practices that can be used to maximize yield or maximize profit, so to speak, right? Now in this system, you're going to have to compromise a little bit, right? Because if you're following corn, you're already going to be limited on when you can get that cereal rye seeded. And so we know that some of our management practices aren't necessarily going for, basically 100% yield potential on that small grain.
So another question, and you've kind of mentioned already that this project is different in that we already, though, also have some information from previous trials that either Ross, you've been involved in, or the Iowa Soybean Association has been involved in. But so overall, how is this current project that's being started, how is it different? What new things is the project looking at?
Well, I'll say one. I think Mark just talked about some of his work, thinking about how we, fine tune some of the management. One of the things that I think will really be advantageous from this is we are going to be collecting some water quality data, both in the on-farm trials with lysimeters and at our Gilmore City site. And so, as we think about this, we think that there's benefit from having that living cover on the land a greater percentage of the year, but we want to quantify if that is the case. And so that's one of the things that I think will be a really important output from this, is looking at what the water quality impacts of this system are compared to, traditional no-till or more traditional no-till with cover crop system. Oh my gosh, something popped up. Sorry. It says confirm your language. It sounds like I switched to a different language. No, I did not switch to speaking German. Man, my enunciation must be really bad today. Another aspect is the work that Dr. John Dahlem is doing on the social science to kind of understand. He's trying to visit with a lot of the farmers, farmers that are involved with us, as well as other farmers that have done relay intercropping, to kind of understand, what some of the barriers may be to be thinking about some of those things that Ross talked about, that what kind of other barriers that maybe we don't even think of we'd have to overcome if we want to scale this up in the future and see it on a greater percentage of the Iowa landscape.
Hey, so another question. So what yield results currently have we seen for the rye and soybeans?
Perfect. So I have my data sheet here. I'm not going to share it because it's not meant for the public facing side, but just to throw out some numbers. And so I'll say as well that 2022 and 2023 were a little tougher with some moisture issues, but looking at relay rye, anywhere from 20 bushels up to 65, 70 bushels. Now, some of those higher yielding rye crops, we tested some hybrid rye in this system, and it performed very well. It's more uniform, easier to harvest, and it yields better, obviously. And then on the soybean side, we've seen from down as low as 14, 15 bushel beans in 2022, and some spots up to 70 bushel, near 70 bushel beans. And really, so when I think about the work that Iowa Soybean has done in this area to lead up to now, and kind of addressing the last question as well, I look at our past few years of data as a pilot study that this practice is possible in the right year under the right management. And so to illustrate that, we've seen a range of, so percentage of sole crops, or percentage of relay crop soybeans compared to sole crop soybeans. And, we've seen as low as like 20, 30% yield up to as high as 80, 90% relay soybeans as compared to sole crop. So, if we're losing 10%, that's a pretty good trade-off for the conservation benefits that the small grain supplies to the system.
Hey, Alex, what type of rye cultivars have been used?
So
I mean, is this mostly VNS, or is it some of the
mostly
stated?
VNS, and then the one Ross, maybe you can say too, 1 or 2 years of hybrid rye that we played with.
Yeah, that's correct. For the most part, VNS, but there, I would say it's kind of an evolution is how we see this go with various producers. So a lot of the people that are interested in trying it the first time are coming in it from I've been doing no-till and cover crops and it's working, but I want to get a little bit more out of it. And so maybe I'll try relays. And then guys that try relays, they see maybe, varied results, most of the time, some level of success. And so then it's like, how do I maximize this even a little further? And so that's where we're looking at things. I know a couple of folks that are on this call, but also that have done trials with us, are starting to look at some of those hybrid options. But there's challenges to that as well. So there's a marketing piece there, and then also just it's a little bit different than the VNS rye, the way it lays out with height and harvest and everything. So, but I guess the overall goal, we are very far from perfecting the system. We know that. What we wanted to show is that first of all we can do it, it will work, and so we've done these trials with Iowa soybean. One or the other, leading the trials across the entire state. We wanted to make sure we got the whole state in there, right? So we tried it in northern Iowa, we've done southern Iowa, we've gone west I-35 all the way to the east to try different landscapes, different soil types, and it's worked everywhere. I would say the one drawback that where it seems to run into problems is moisture. That's where we seem to have a hiccup. So, but otherwise it's pretty much working.
Do either of you have enough on, so to speak, the economics around the hybrid rye, or is it just better to go with, a stated variety or even VNS from an economic standpoint?
I would say I don't have enough to speak to the economics of it. Yeah.
I would say the catch there is making sure you have a place to sell it, because it cannot be resold for seed.
The hybrid rye.
Correct.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So it's just a little bit more limiting that way. What we did see is incredible yields, because the hybrid rye in particular, it matures and more evenly, and so and then pollinates all at the same time. So you get a much more consistent stand, and a much fuller head versus the VNS, which, when you look at a field of VNS rye, you see plants that are, just as high as the soybeans. You see plants that are mostly, a foot and a half above the soybeans, and then you got these flyers that are like way up there. So you just get a little bit of everything. The hybrid rye is a much more even, stand and everything like that. So I think there's a lot of potential there. It's just the market part of it is limiting. And we worked with KWS a little bit. They put out some hybrid rye, and that's one of their challenges as well. So that's definitely on the radar. That's where we could see really good benefits if we could tap into either a food or a livestock feed market, because that would be the option there, because the yields are outstanding.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're also getting some questions asking if we're testing in this new project or about different rye varieties, soybean varieties, and also maturity of soybeans. So if anyone wants to take a stab at any of that.
Yeah, so
So-
on a couple of research farms, we are going to do soybean maturities. We'll have two different maturities, kind of I'll call it a normal and a later one. And then the other component that we're adding into a couple of the small grain variety trials up in Nashua and Kanawha, where we have VNS rye plus the stated rye that they have already, and then a couple of the hybrid rye varieties. So we will have some information on that. Now, those rye variety trials, obviously that's not in a relay crop system, but kind of gives you a yield level, of where the differences come out. Alex, did you want to talk a little bit about what you've seen and heard on some of the
Yeah.
comparisons that you've already done?
Yep. So, like I said, we've looked at a bunch of this data and sliced it different ways to find correlations, mostly to soybean yield. And like I mentioned, there's two main factors that have a correlation with yield, and it's the harvest date of the rye and the maturity of the soybeans. So I'll let Mark speak to the plant physiology of why a longer maturing soybean seems to work better in this system, but it looks like it does. And we did a few sites in 2023, full width relay, but comparing two maturities of soybeans. And we had some drought woes and some data issues, but a few sites that went well, there was a pretty significant advantage of, at least, so our biggest spread was like a half maturity group of soybeans. So like a 3.5 and a 4.0, and, 5 or 6 bushel on the later maturity. So
physiologically, I suspect what's happening is that, so we've lengthened out our vegetative just based on when the soybeans are planted, but a longer maturity is going to have a longer seed fill time frame. So a half maturity group or a full maturity group, you may gain roughly 2 weeks of seed fill, right? And if you can get a couple rains in that seed fill period, that can really make a difference. Now the caveat is if you have a early fall frost, then all bets are off. But if you can catch those rains on a longer maturity, it should end up paying off for you.
Yeah, so a longer season being planted earlier. That's the planted
Yeah.
earlier. I don't know if you said that or not, but that seems to be a good. I mean, we had people planting relay beans as early as like the first week of April, well before the corn. So that seems to be a big thing.
And these soybeans need to be planted earlier, right? Largely because you have to get them planted before the cereal rye puts the jointed stems out, because otherwise you'll do too much damage to them, and that will create some other problems.
All right, so now we've got some questions about crop insurance. How does this relay intercropping system now fit in with crop insurance? And yeah, basically, does it affect the ability to get insurance for your soybeans? Which I think I know the answer, but I want to pass it off to any of you to answer.
Well, I'll tell you, nobody wants to be the insurance person. So as of, I think, 2 years ago, RMA changed provisions to allow relay cropping as an insurable practice. There is some paperwork that goes along with it, a letter from an agronomist, and things like that. However, before that, it was not insurable at all. And when we say an insurable practice, to be clear, we're saying only the soybeans within relay cropping are insurable. Cereal rye is not an insurable crop in Iowa at all, whether by itself or in relay system. So maybe that will change in the future if more people start growing cereal rye for seed, but at this point it is not. So I would say definitely if you're thinking about insuring relays, work very closely with your agent, ask a lot of questions and make sure that everything is very clear before going into it. A lot of people are still electing not to take insurance because it's a new thing, right? So even though it's allowable now, doesn't mean it's a perfect system. The more people that do it, the more data that they'll have, and the more they'll be able to smooth out some of the things that come along with it, because it's not a standard practice, and so they need data to figure it out. So I should say, RMA is relying a lot on farmers to provide that data through this project, through us, through Iowa Soybeans. So that they're taking a bit of a leap to even allow the practice off of a pretty small amount of data. So that's good, but they need more, and it's a work in progress. So that's what I don't know everything about it, but that's it is allowable at least now.
Is there some caveat that if you file a claim like 2 out of 3 years that you won't be able to get the soybeans insured anymore?
Yeah, that's something I heard from an RMA guy
Okay.
that if they pay two claims, basically a two strike rule. Yep.
Okay. I thought that was what, yeah, maybe it was in our meeting on Monday
Yeah,
that
it was,
that
and I
came
don't
up.
have
Yeah, okay.
yeah, not a ton of detail. Like, does it have to be the same field? You know, anything like that. But yeah, there's definitely fine print to pay attention to.
All right, so this next question has a short season spring wheat and a long season soybean been planted with the same equipment and same pass to eliminate trips and damage to either crops? Has that happened?
I'm seeing Alex shake his head no, and I have not heard anything. The only anecdote I would tell you is that I think spring wheats tend to mature later. And I think they're also a little bit shorter. Wheat's, well, wheat's just shorter than rye. And winter wheat is taller than spring wheat as well. And so I think there's going to be some more challenges with the spring wheat, you know, in seeding at the same time as compared to using a winter wheat or a winter rye.
I
Okay,
only know of a couple people trying, or at least one person that's tried spring barley and maybe oats as well. I think it went okay. It is feasible, but it's probably the rye just works really well because you're able to plant it in the fall and then it gets very tall. I don't, would now be a good time to show maybe the harvesting videos if people would be interested in that?
yeah,
And
go
so,
for it.
okay, maybe I'll do that quick. And so a lot of folks that are trying this are harvesting with a platform head. But a row crop head can actually work better. But maybe this will help folks visualize a little bit so you can see what that looks like. And then I'll show one more here while I'm up. Oops. Let's see here. Did you see that one or no? Okay, I'll try
No,
again.
we did. Yeah.
Stopped sharing for some reason.
Yeah, there we go.
So you can see in both of those, basically you have a big, gosh. The rye has a big gap between the beans. And so that's why it works so well with that. It works, and that's because people have that platform head available. There's no equipment augmenting that needs to happen to get a good harvest off the rye. That being said, they're keeping the platform up higher than they probably would if they were just harvesting the rye, so they know a lot of times you're missing some of that rye. That's why you get quite a bit of volunteer, like I think Mark mentioned earlier. However, we have had a couple of producers, and I know, you know, through our trials and other people doing it in other parts of the country that have augmented row crop heads to push down the beans better and get a tighter harvest. So if you're doing this on a larger scale on more acres with a shorter crop like wheat or, you know, even barley or oats for that matter, you could, you know, use something like that, you know, it just tightens everything up and you're able to get over those beans and get a clean harvest on the cereal grain that way.
Perfect. Okay, and just if you still have a question, feel free to submit it into the chat. Another question that we've got here is, how is the seed density of relay intercrop soybeans compared to solo soybeans?
The population of the soybeans, I'm assuming, is what we're asking. Yeah. So we haven't really examined it. My hunch, and maybe Mark talks about this too, but my hunch would be maybe if we pushed soybean seeding rate a little bit in this practice, with the assumption that we're going to get less flowers, pods, and seeds per plant than we would in a sole crop soybean situation. But that's, I don't have data to back that up per se, but something I'd be interested in.
Alex, that's exactly the theory that I'm running with right now. So hopefully we learn more in the next year or two.
All right, well, that looks like all the questions I've gotten in the chat. You've all answered some of the questions before I even had a chance to ask them with some of your other answers. So I just want to really quickly go ahead and share my screen here. I think I got it. I think if you're all seeing this, hopefully. But I just want to remind you all, next 2 weeks from now, we will be having a new direction in cover crops, developing a perennial ground cover for corn systems in the Midwest, as well as if you joined us today and you're wanting to get a CCA CEU, go ahead and email me at alenaw@iastate.edu by 5 p.m. today with your name you entered to watch this, and your CCA number. So again, email me, Elena Winokur, alenaw@iastate.edu by 5 p.m. today. If you are interested and you're an Iowa landowner in a wetland, an oxbow, or bioreactor, or even a saturated buffer, you can email us at ilf@iastate.edu, and we'll connect you with someone within IDOLS to get that process started. And one last thing, if you've joined us live today, and this is your first live webinar or virtual field day you've joined us with in 2024, if you want to go ahead and submit our voluntary demographic survey, it's found at iowalearningfarms.org/survey. So otherwise, let's see if I got any more questions. I did have another question come in. They've said, if you haven't already answered this, is there any future work with winter wheat?
I think we'd be interested for sure. We've spoke with some growers in other states, and they're playing with wheat. Not just wheat either. We talk about oil seeds potentially, and other crops as well. So still in the infancy.
Yeah, I agree with Alex. I think there's some other potentials out there just, beyond what we're talking about here today. I think with winter wheat, it's going to be fairly similar to with the cereal rye, but there may be some small differences just because the winter wheat is going to be shorter than that rye. But yeah, I think it can still work.
All right, we've got another question. They're asking, have there been any trials conducted in an organic system?
Yes, we have had one. We did one down near Newton, Iowa. And actually that producer was using relays as a way to convert his system to organic. So it was in his 3-year transition period from conventional to organic, and he was using relays as a way to grow his soybean crop, but also not have to do tillage. So that's kind of the biggest kind of knock, I guess, against organic production is a lot of times tillage. And so the cereal rye is a natural weed suppressant and makes a good option for suppressing weeds for organic production. We have seen, I think there was one other, I can think of maybe one other trial that was an attempted organic relay plot, and that one got pretty weedy. So I think, it's pretty limited in terms of data. We don't have a lot of data, but I think if you have a fairly clean field, you can do, that could be done organically without seeing a lot of weed problems. Because we do have a lot of producers that are, they're not using any herbicide during the relay trial, but they're not organic. So I think if you're starting with a fairly clean field, rye is pretty effective as a weed suppressant. If you have a weedy field, it's probably going to be weedy even when you put rye out there.
Perfect. Okay, and we've also got in here, have you ever, or has any trials been ever tried for different row spacings?
No, so most of our beans, I think, have been in 30 inches. The closest, we've had a variety of small grain rows, whether we've row index left that space or solid seeded, but we haven't compared those like in a replicated strip trial, same field. So comparison across sites would kind of be the best that we would have.
All right, well, that looks like all the questions we have in the chat. Thank you everyone for joining us today. To our speakers, if any of you have anything that you want to say, if you want to wrap up with anything, feel free. Otherwise, yeah, if you want to, go ahead and unmute now. Otherwise, thank you all for joining today. And we'll see you in 2 weeks for our perennial ground cover virtual field day.